All right. Hi, folks. Welcome to our webinar. We got an action-packed 30 minutes. My name is Adam Warbeck. I'm a managing director at Tallan. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues, Gerard McGann. He's also a director at the company. He's really the one responsible for a lot of our thinking around Agile and DevOps. So you've got the subject matter expert on the phone here. And also with us is Ryan Clark. He is one of our practice managers. And together we deliver a lot of solutions for clients, taking them through this digital product journey and using Agile and DevOps to help us be successful. They say to start with why, so that's what we're going to do for our agenda today. We're going to start with I'll get us out of the gate with a little bit about why DevOps. Then I'm going to hand it over to Gerard, who's going to go through the DevOps process, how it combines with Agile, where you can look for opportunities. And then we'll conclude. Ryan's going to take us through some ideas on how to take that first step. So hopefully very educational with some practical advice for you folks on how to get going. So why DevOps? I like to think about it as how do we be competitive in this digital economy, especially now coming out of this pandemic. As tech staff and leadership at our companies, we're going to be asked and have already been asked, either for advice on how to create digital solutions that can put us in touch with our customers and closer to them. And a lot of times, or many times, the business has ideas for things, and we have to respond and be able to deliver those things. All that kind of gets folded under this umbrella of innovation, digital innovation. I should be specific. I have a friend that works in innovation at Diageo, who is a company that sells a lot of the liquor that we drink, if you drink. And so there's obviously innovation in all kinds of industries. But here we're going to talk about digital innovation and how we use digital to compete. And so to do these kinds of innovations, we have to be agile because there's no one big bang, road to success. It's a lot of, starting with some understanding of the market and then trying things and then bringing things to market, reacting to what our customers are telling us and going through that life cycle. And then, so to be agile, if we believe that to be successful, we need to be agile, then to be agile, we absolutely believe that you need DevOps because of all the automation that it brings and all the productivity gains and just controls that it puts in place around your infrastructure, your code, and the quality ultimately of the products you develop. There's no other way to do it at the scale and the speed that you need to be working at other than to combine these three things. I like to tell the story of Nike just to kind of illustrate the example. When you're doing digital innovation, a lot of times it's either about bringing products to market or services to market. So in this case, let's start talking about products. So if you are a fan of Nike, you probably already taken advantage of a lot of what they have to offer. They've gone well beyond just selling shoes online, right? And the fact that they're selling shoes is almost in the background to the fact that they understand why people are using shoes. So as an example of a product, you've got this running club, right? So if you're a runner and the reason you buy shoes is because you like to run, they've created this whole entire ecosystem for you to be successful, to champion that, and to help you feel like an athlete at the end of the day, right? And that's just one of many products. And just to kind of reiterate the theme, it wasn't a big bang approach. It's about understanding the customer and bringing that to market. On the services side, believe it or not, there's actually shoes as a service, right? So if you're a busy parent and you don't have time to go shopping on the weekend for shoes, it's something that, maybe your kids can get a box of Nike shoes in the mail every month or every 3 months, however frequently, and they ask you that. They ask you how quickly your kids go through the shoes. They price it accordingly, but for a subscription fee, you can get a bunch of sneakers for your kids to try on, and you pick one pair that they like, they send the rest back, and the problem is solved. And so, if by creating these experiences, either through the form of those products or these subscriptions, we're connecting with our customers, we're really understanding the needs and filling those needs of our customers. Bringing this kind of stuff to market is what we're centering today's talk around, and why we think you need to be agile and why you need DevOps. Nothing says success than looking at somebody's stock price. So if we take Nike, for example, I pulled this up yesterday. I think they're actually down a couple bucks today because they had earnings last night. But the point being is that if you look at, March, April, where everybody's investments were and equities were tanking, they did dip as well. But if you look at where we are now, they've climbed right back and are back to essentially basically where they started the year. On the flip side, if you look at one of their competitors, Under Armour, doesn't have the same ecosystem, doesn't have that same sort of connection with their customers, doesn't have some of the same success, but is in the same exact industry, and they dipped and still have yet to climb back. And so that's a dollar and cents way of pointing out how this is important. I want to conclude here just as I toss it over to Gerard to talk a little bit about the process that you can follow. Obviously, it's very iterative, so showing this kind of in a linear way like this is a very high level view. But if you think about shaping and starting your strategy, you want to basically have an understanding of the market, develop that vision. Then you're going to go into design. And here's where you start to put together those initial prototypes and sketches of what the experience might look like. And then you can actually take that back to your strategy team, which is often your product team, and validate that and have them validate it with a focus group or whatever. And so you can kind of loop through that. But when you're ready to kind of move into that bottom tier, the build layer, this is where all the engineering happens. And this is where we're going to focus. So we're basically zooming into this bottom rung of this diagram. We're now, past the strategy phase, past the design phase. Not that it's not iterative, it very much is, but we've got some initial concepts and some initial ideas, and it's time to bring the engineers into the room and start to plan and start to engineer and test, and then ultimately launch. And this is where I want to toss it over to you, Gerard, and help us understand how to be successful down here in this bottom rung.
All right, great. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, so with regard to DevOps and Agile, there's been a lot of probably articles you've read, especially maybe even books, digital books, of course, these days, about DevOps. And, what we want to do first is to really talk about what DevOps is first, because that's, it's very important to understand, obviously, especially in this kind of webinar. I'm going to give you a walkthrough of that, and then we'll go into some deeper subjects about it. What I like to do is kind of break it down to three high level. We got, people, process, and the tools. And, we have to understand that when you start to embrace the DevOps process, or even Agile for that matter, it is a cultural movement. It's not something that you can just start from the top and say, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. And it's very structured. And yes, it is. There is some structure to it. But you have to buy in with your teams, because teams themselves are very dynamic. You got different personalities. You have, maybe a lead who just really wants to get into the code, but wants to make sure that they're delivering, effectively. You have a developer who just really just all in the code, right? And that's all they want to do is just code. They're not really thinking about, the business as a whole and how what they're doing is affecting the business. However, what they do want to see is what they're building is actually providing some value. I mean, that's certainly a good feel for them. And as a team, working together, whether to, QA, infrastructure, again, the developers together working as a whole is what you're trying to achieve, to really be effective in the process and being able to release more quickly and get that value out there. And so, the whole point of DevOps is to accelerate the process, to have the business realize that value, and the teams themselves to realize what they're building, and they're seeing more incremental progress at a faster rate. It's just this certain need to start building on that more effectively, not just effectively, but the need to start building on it much bigger and much faster, and getting that kind of feel good, need to put something out there. And then the people themselves, it's just that's just it. The actual structure and putting some type of structure around that is what teams need. They need that structure in order to, kind of gel that chemistry along with the team. And so, regardless of, the idea of what DevOps is, regardless of what role they are part of, they're all working together against the same goal. And that's very important to understand. There's a lot of organizations today that are still very large and kind of set in their ways. And what they do is they separate infrastructure from the developers. Maybe if you have a design team, they're separated from the developers and infrastructure. But ultimately, you really have to look at it and say, well, how can I efficiently bring that all together to make them all work together? And by the way, the business too is part of the people process. It's not just about the engineering team. It's they have to be involved just as much as the engineers have to be involved. And so in today's world, where a lot of companies, even the ones that have been around for hundreds of years or 100 years, 100 years, they realize that there's some need for engineering in their company in today's world. And so they're still trying to figure out, and maybe you're part of some of these companies, you're still trying to figure out how to effectively bring all this together so you can deliver in a digital world. So the process of DevOps is kind of just that. It tries to bring all those pieces of the puzzle together. And it starts with 8 phases. You got the planning phase, which a lot of you are familiar with to some degree. You probably, I'm sure you all do it differently. It starts off with just an idea, a vision, requirements. Maybe not a full-on like new product or new service, but it could just be an enhancement to something that already exists. And so you're going to plan that out, and then you're going to implement it. So in this case, code is another phase within DevOps for those in the engineering side of things. And then you're going to build it and you're going to test it. And build and test is you're going to put it together. It's going to compile. It's going to create a manifest or an artifact of some sort. And then it's going to be tested. And the part of DevOps where the test and the release, this is where things start to get a little interesting, because if maybe right now you might have some building that you're doing with the solution you're working with, but are you incrementally testing it, through an automated process, let's say, or do the developers have to do it themselves as part of a step to make sure that they didn't break anything? And that's what they, when you talk about DevOps and build and test, it's about bringing in some of that incremental testing that happens more continuously than just ad hoc on a developer's local workstation. And then release deploy is where DevOps starts to call into that continuous delivery. So build and test is continuous integration, while release and deploy is continuous delivery. And I'm sure a lot of you, if you've been reading about DevOps, you hear that a lot. CI/CD pipelines. And that's kind of what I'm describing here. And that's what you see here in the release and deploy. And the release and deploy is effectively getting to that efficiency of being able to release and deploy into your deployment target, whether that's in the cloud or on-prem. It's still at the end of the day a deployment target. So although there's a lot of talk around how DevOps really works well with the cloud, it's not that DevOps works well with the cloud. It's the tools that I'm going to be talking a little bit about later in this webinar about how they work very well with the cloud. And we all know today that in 2020, being in the cloud is actually, is a journey that most of your organizations are probably looking to go to. And a lot of the tools that we use today in engineering work very well with the cloud. But even then, if adopting a DevOps process does not mean you need to be in the cloud, and just to be clear about that. And then lastly is the operate and the monitor. And these kind of work together. This is, where kind of DevOps shines. There's a lot, there's been a lot of movement around being able to have tools that you could easily monitor the environment and know when something's going to go wrong, and to be able to respond to it quickly, and either be proactive and, unfortunately, in a reactive mode, where you might have to have the infrastructure to be able to quickly stand up a new system to keep the system running, being able to cut over to maybe a warm standby or whatever the case may be. And then, that's the monitoring, standpoint. I kind of talked about a little bit about the operation. The monitoring also a little bit deeper is you have people on call, where maybe, you have some tools that if something goes wrong, they get immediately notified. They're completely plugged into the environment and be able to respond to that quickly and be able to stand up, like I said, a new environment or a new system, or be able to fail over to another environment. So, that's really, from a phase standpoint, that's what DevOps really starts to talk about. But what I really want to start focusing in on and talk about today is that kind of connection between when monitor ends and plan begins. And it's more so around the planning. If you read a lot about DevOps, you'll see that they do talk about the plan, but what they don't really say out loud is how do you effectively create this iterative motion within your process. They talk about waterfall, even in DevOps, and they talk about Agile in DevOps, and talk about extreme programming in DevOps, and they talk about all these things, but they don't say, hey, to get the best bang from your buck or the best efficiency, you maybe should just trial some Agile principles and apply that here. And that's where we're going to be really diving into. So the other part is the tools. And, you got your plan and track, which is, planning and tracking can come in many different forms. You can see here, it says Kanban board, right? So that's Agile principle right there. But they don't have to be, it could be a spreadsheet, although not ideal. It could be a Microsoft project plan. It could be, some type of level of dashboards that, you're able to track your activities. Obviously in today's, what we're talking about today, using Kanban boards or task boards, something to understand where you are in the process of the planning is very important. And then with the build and test, it's about bringing in the tools that can automate your continuous integration of a developer that makes a change in code, applies it, it gets built automatically right there for that individual developer, and then it gets tested, right? Because you want to have that continuous integration, because what DevOps likes to do as part of the process is to fail fast. If something is found that breaks the build, the whole team and that individual should know immediately so it can be fixed. Not after it hits QA or not after it hits staging or production. If there is it's not just about whether or not there's a semicolon at the end of the line and the build fails. That's easy. It's a unit test that runs, that tests an algorithm that's deep in your solution that no longer meets those results. And because and if let's say logical expression changed, and now all of a sudden it was slightly changed to where sometimes it passes and sometimes it fails, maybe it could even be worse than that. And now all of a sudden it's letting you know immediately that something's wrong and it needs to be fixed. From the release part, I kind of talked about this. It's deploying into some deployment target. It could be cloud-based, and it could be cloud-based in this form of IaaS, infrastructure as a service. It could be PaaS, platform as a service. It could be on-prem. It could be in Docker containers. It doesn't matter. And it could be a hybrid of both, by the way. We talked to a lot of customers where they're like, I don't want to go all the way to the cloud. We're not ready yet, but we still want to maybe put our DR in there, and we want to deploy to the cloud, but also deploy to on-prem. Yes, these tools these days, they do that, and they have the capability of doing that. And so you could deploy in two spots at the same time without having your team deploy in sequence to each. If you have a web farm, right, and you have like 5 front-end servers, and the team has to go in and deploy to each one. That's just silly these days. The tools that able to deploy can handle all that without the team actually interacting with these systems. And then with monitoring operations, I kind of mentioned, that's the oversight, and there's this concept of AI ops now with products like Splunk and then Elk or Elastic that really are able to look at the environment as a whole and report that under a unified dashboard to be able to make you understand how healthy your environment is and be able to be proactive when something is about to go wrong, and then have the tools necessary to be having your engineers plugged in with their mobile phones and get notifications about something's about to happen. Let's respond to it. And that's the nature of where we are with some of these tools. Very, very powerful stuff. And all of that is feeding into the continuous delivery pipeline, right? Because the idea is to not be afraid to constantly deliver. A lot of organizations get into this mode of having change management reviews weekly. And then what happens when, somebody misses that meeting, right? A meeting like a project manager is unable to make that meeting and they couldn't get their change request in and then have that reviewed and approved. Do they have to wait another week? Well, that's kind of silly. That's the kind of process you're trying to automate. So, you could actually incorporate some of these change management processes that maybe you do today as part of the pipeline This way people can be notified when something's about to change and then review it and approve it. And in lieu of, and making that very dynamic, in lieu of having a structured meeting every week or every 2 weeks or once a month, and then all of a sudden something happens where that change request gets missed, and then they got to wait another month potentially, or ask for a isolated meeting just to have that approved. And that's the kind of the beauty of the process and the tools that you have available to you. So, talking about that where I kind of highlighted that intersection in the DevOps process, where we talk about where monitor means plan again, and you're starting the process all over again. That's where I want to start talking about Agile. So some of the common delivery challenges some of you have is probably some low deployment frequencies, and you're probably releasing once a month, maybe once every other month. Some of you are probably on a better cadence of maybe every 2 weeks. Maybe you are doing some Agile practices and you're able to get out every 2 weeks, and that's great. But at the same time, are you getting everything out that the business wants, right? Are you constantly horse trading requirements because the business, you're not really working with the business effectively to be able to get their value out there sooner and on time? Right. So, that's, if you're getting releases out there more frequently, that's great. If you're really still challenged by the business to get all their value out, and all of a sudden you're really at once a month, once every other month, once a quarter, 6 months, that's where, are you really staying ahead of getting that value out there? And then what does it take to get the requirements, that first requirement or that first vision of the business is asking, and getting that into production? How long do you need to understand what it takes to understand what that new enhancement is, and then be able to get that in production? How much lead time do you need? Do you need a month? Do you need 2 months? Is that because of the way you're working with BAs or the business? Because they need that lead time in order to, for the engineering teams to understand what needs to get done. And it might, so if you figure, if you have a low deployment frequency for 1 month and you need another month's lead time to at least understand what the requirements are, now you're really talking about that value ask now takes about 2 months to get into production, right? That's what we're talking about here. And then with the high change of failure rate. So how effective are you in your quality with regard to getting production code out there? Meaning, like, there's a lot of post-production issues that are found, or during QA, or testing, are you really finding the good bugs that, are getting in front of customer functionality right away when it hits production? It's very important to be able to mitigate that as part of the process. And I'm sure a lot of you are like, oh yeah, that happens. Yeah, we hit production, and all of a sudden there's somebody clicks a button and then they get an exception, or they get a contact technical support for further assistance, and because whatever part of that system didn't get the amount of testing coverage that it needed at the time of testing and that testing phase. And then, like I was mentioning before, like with the AI ops and being able to respond to issues, right, in the environment, the long mean time to recover. This is kind of important. Is how fast are you in bringing the system and the service back up again? Once it goes down, or maybe maybe not even a system. Like, we think about systems as a whole, but it doesn't have to be. It could be one of the APIs that are hosting or the solution, right? And that API goes down, and then all of a sudden part of the solution goes down. Nobody really notices right away. And then until somebody reports it, because it's like maybe 20% of the 80% of the application. And how fast are you going to come back, be able to bring that back up again? Or how fast are you going to be able to deploy code if there's a critical issue that needs to be fixed? And that's, this is where DevOps comes into play and Agile comes into play. So all of you think about it, right? You all have a timeline that we're all against when we're delivering a solution, or whatever the feature, new enhancement features, bug fixes out there. It's all some type of timeline. And a lot of you are probably thinking about thinking about your process now, and thinking about reflecting on what I'm saying. And the first one that comes to mind is waterfall. Some of you may be still practicing this way. Some of you may be applying agile practices with waterfall in some form, right? Like agile fall is a term out there. And you start from the top where you get to define and build, and then you test and release, and it takes a while for that release to get out there, right? It still does. There's a lot of documentation up front. Requirements get documented, and then before you know it, you're out. It takes a while for you to get out there, get the value out there, and so with Agile, the idea is what you want to do. You start off small with the same phases that Waterfall has to offer. And what maybe that you follow, and you get a small incremental value release out there, and then you do another, and then you do another, and you're just building on it constantly. And that's what you ultimately want to do. And that's where Agile and DevOps come into play, because that intersection I was talking about is where you're coming back around and you're doing planning and you're doing building and you're releasing, and they both go hand in hand with regard to that. So you're in some cases, when you say you're doing Agile, let's talk about some of the common anti-patterns that, are kind of creep up, when organizations try to do Agile, and it's still painfully trying to do that transformation. There's usually a lack of communication with stakeholders, very common, where the product owners themselves or stakeholders are not really involved with the prioritization process, or you get the requirements and the engineers just kind of run off with it and still build everything anyway. And they're doing Agile, but they're not really checking back with the users, say, hey, we still on track. Now that things came out this way, should we maybe pivot a little bit? And then because of that, there's loss of project work time, right? There's all this work that's being done. And yes, again, you're delivering agilely, or you're getting some value out there, but there's really none of that business feedback. And then in turn, you might not be, it might take a long time to get the production release out there. And then the last one is kind of very important that I think we've all seen before, is that there's requirements that are defined, and then later on, because you might be doing delivering in a way that you're not really in parallel with the business, showing them the results, and you're building requirements that the business at one time said they wanted it, but maybe somewhere down the line, as you started developing the solution, they may have a different view about it, because now they actually have something tangible to work with. They see it and they're like, oh, wait a second, we thought we wanted this, but now we wanted X, but now we want Y. And that happens very, very often. And then you bring in DevOps into the mix, and some of the things that you may not be doing, right now with regard to DevOps, although you may say you're doing DevOps practices, is that you might have some slow change management procedures. I kind of talked about that early on. You might have these structured change management meetings that have to, where you have to get approvals done. You might have some isolated security practices where they're not really being done at the define stage, definition stage, or planning stage. And you're kind of done at the latter end of the stages, where it's more on the infrastructure side, because your infrastructure team and your engineering team aren't working effectively together. So then it's kind of realized at the end of the process, oh, what do we need to do to stand this up and make sure it's secure? What do we need to do to make sure that we're and for organizations that need to meet regulations, are we following those regulations, those compliance requirements? And that's, so when you look at it from that standpoint, you think about maybe some of the practices you have today, you probably realize, oh boy, yeah, we're not really doing things the way we thought we were. But these two do work together very effectively, Agile and DevOps. If you think about it, Agile itself is about continuous feedback, delivery. The delivery, I guess, kind of falls on DevOps. The feedback falls on Agile. And when they work together very effectively, because you're constantly giving feedback to the business. But the only way to give constant feedback to the business is if you're doing continuous delivery. And so, even though Agile is known as been the software development framework that was created, almost 2 decades ago, if not a little bit more now, DevOps has also been around for about a decade. And somehow, again, nobody's really mentioned that they kind of work really well together. But they very much go hand in hand. So teams that innovate faster really can really achieve a higher performance, a higher performance as a team. If you look at the bottom number, you see like 200, 400 times improvements in the code commit to deployment, right? When a lot of people think about DevOps and they think about that point, it's the code commit. And with the code commit, it's, they think about the code commit, the build, the test, and the release. And if you do automate your process effectively, you can achieve those types of numbers. And if you get the right tools in place, then you can achieve those numbers. And with if you're doing that in tandem with, automating your process, you can achieve faster deployment cycles. And if the teams are innovating faster, they're improving their quality because they got good automation in place. They're able to effectively have the right checks in place before it hits production. You're really looking at improved quality. And then more importantly, if they're innovating faster with proper automation, they can actually deliver more value with new software and services at a much higher rate. So as DevOps as an opportunity is that it's very important to understand that, your businesses think as far as an idea, and they also think about it in terms of its idea to cash, because as a business, that's almost every business that you all work for. At the end of the day, they're in the business of making money, and they do provide a service. Don't get me wrong, but at the end of the day, there's some value in return. And so as when you start to embark on any kind of like agile transformation or DevOps transformation, and working with both, it's very important that you understand that you constantly analyze each part of your process, and that process effectively is called a value stream. And each one of those pieces of the process need to be reevaluated every single time to make sure that you're actually working efficiently. And here's a sample right now, and this is actually something that Nike puts together. It's part of Nike.com that they reevaluate every single time, every single iteration, to know whether or not how efficient they are in their process and their value stream process. And you see it's a little bit of a dashboard there. It's got some down trends and some up trends, doing well in some areas, doing down. And that constant process evaluation, it's very important going into any kind of journey into a DevOps iterative process or agile process, to be able to tell the business, hey, yeah, we're doing well in these areas. This is where we're not doing well. Let's try to figure out how to make it more efficient and be able to show value to the business more frequently or more effectively. So when you're evaluating your practices, you really want to start from you're going to start from the plan and code, and you're going to take in consideration some of the aspects of application risks, if it's an application or solution risk, any kind of security needs up front, because you really want to make sure that these things are being taken into consideration when you're thinking about any kind of plan, when it's part of the planning stage, when you're ready to implement these parts and pieces are being considered. Then with the build and test, you're going to bring in things like code quality and vulnerability testing, right? You can incorporate tools and part of your process to ensure that for every time code is committed, these things are being tested and applied. And because if you define that up front, what the security needs are, let's say, then that means you could tweak your tools to make sure that those vulnerabilities are being considered when a coder puts their code together. And then finally, with the release and monitor, the idea is if you're doing all the definition up front of your security needs, let's say performance measures, system design, right? All that then flows down to your environment, where you can incorporate the change management pieces as part of your automation, and release approvals as part of your automation, bringing in the right roles. It's not going to be the dev team saying, oh yeah, I got to change and I'm going to improve it. It's bringing your infrastructure team to say, oh, all right, so the team wants to deploy a new virtual machine out there. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and improve that. And yes, there are tools out there that could automate that process. That's in the cloud, of course. Obviously, if it was on-prem, there would have to be some other process there. But And then more importantly, and then finally, be able to, as part of the release, is be able to do some automated testing as well as a final test. And then you're just going to start the whole process over again, because the key is that what you really want to do is that the Agile and DevOps, they don't always, it's not just about the iterative process and delivering value, but it gives you the ability to reevaluate your risks, your design, your approach, and making sure that it's still aligned to your original vision. Unlike waterfall, when you start from the very top and then end up, doing some release 6 or 7 months later, big release that is, the business may realize that, oh yeah, we know we asked for this thing, but now we got to start making some changes. So with it's really process plus tools here. You hear me talking about these tools that could be to do these great things. And, here's just a list of like all the things that you should be looking for when you're thinking about, going into a DevOps process. And, you really want to look at team collaboration. That's a key aspect. Being sure that value is recognized by the business, being able to, improve the efficiencies and more so the productivity. Like those to me, those are the pretty much the highlights. And if you are going to embark on something like this, it's very important to make sure you have high transparency on the process and how it's affecting the business positively. And like I said, there are tools out there that can do these things. Azure DevOps is a great ALM tool that has everything from soup to nuts. With regard to planning and building and testing and releasing. Puppet is another one. We got, I'm trying to think here, Bitbucket is another one that could take care of it. BitLab is also like that full ALM solution, and they all have these capabilities. Where a lot of these tools fall short is in the kind of the monitoring of the systems, and that's where, depending on where you are, if you're in Azure, you might be looking at application insights. With some Azure logs, or you could adopt things like Splunk and Elk that already have these things built in and be able to monitor your system. So you got to understand what kind of mashup of tools you want to bring to a tool chain in order to be able to put this together and be able to deploy effectively. So finally, an effective process does fuel business. And right out of Microsoft Build recently, and also this was actually a report that was put together by McKinsey and Company. If an effective process that works really well could actually have a direct bottom line effect on the business, where here I'm showing a higher revenue growth, but that's because the teams are able to innovate at a much higher pace. So if you give them the tools they need to work effectively, work efficiently, more productively, you're really looking at a greater value back to the business, which in turn would end up being higher revenue, of course. So Ryan, I'll leave it over to you now and finalize this webinar. So thanks for listening.
Awesome, thanks, Gerard. Yeah, so I just wanted to dive in. So Gerard just went through a lot of different content, and just a lot of you are probably wondering, well, how do I even get started on this, and how do I get moving on these next steps? So typically what we've been seeing with a lot of our customers and their approach, and honestly how we approach it to at Tallan when we work with clients, is really identifying that first small initiative. So there's one customer we're working with now. They're a large insurance company, and they kind of had all these different groups that were on different kind of journeys and stages in terms of adopting DevOps and Agile practices. So, we're working with a multitude of different groups there. And for each one, it started with identifying kind of a small project and ultimately getting buy-in from that initial team. So, usually starting small from what we've seen is the best practice there. And then in working through that initiative that you identify, ultimately what you're trying to do is increase transparency, and by that we mean increase transparency between everyone in that selected group for that particular initiative, but also increasing transparency back to the business as you're going through this initiative and understanding sort of the new ways of thinking. And that kind of goes into the next phase, which is really embracing innovation, because a lot of what Gerard talked about today is, Agile and DevOps together, they pose, kind of a change to the way that you're thinking and the way that you're kind of embracing your process. So it's really important to, every step of the way kind of be embracing this change and embracing this new way of thinking. And then another thing Gerard talked a lot about at the end there was these different value streams. So always making sure that you're tracking value along the way. So from the very beginning of identifying the initiative and then starting to work through it, each step of the way you want to make sure that you're tracking the value and you're also bringing that back to the business of here's where we're increasing our speed, or we're doing things more efficient or faster than we were before, and kind of just continuing through that process. And I guess just to recap that, kind of always start small, and then, working through and tracking value is ultimately the key to success there. And then when you're looking at kind of what to look for, there's kind of these 5 core buckets that we typically see customers looking at. So when you look at each one, you may already have a good process for planning or testing. So it's really identifying, where you may have gaps. So we encourage, our clients and, those that we're working with now, each group that we work with, we kind of go through these 5 things to see ultimately, where do you have gaps, and where can we start to identify those gaps at any part of these different phases, and then from there we'll really dive into that initiative, whether it's around your planning process or your coding and building process, and that will be what you start with and start to move forward and track value against. And then if you guys are looking for any sort of help or additional insight, like I said, we work with a lot of customers, not just on like the DevOps tool set, but also helping them adopt these sort of processes within their application and software development organizations. So ultimately, we could help you identify some of those gaps in the different buckets that I described on the last slide. And then ultimately start to prove value back to the business and implement those solutions. And to the right there, you see our kind of our DevOps services menu. So that's really everything we could help with. And typically what I recommend is that to start with an assessment. So ultimately, the assessment will help us evaluate, where your gaps are already, and where there may be move for improvement to, and ultimately identify that first small initiative, and then move forward from there. So I definitely encourage anyone that wants to have additional conversations one-on-one, to talk more about your process, to reach out to myself, Adam, or Gerard, connect with us on LinkedIn. We're more than happy to be a resource, have conversations with you, and ultimately help you guys continue to drive these sort of initiatives forward. And then there's a quick survey online we created for this webinar. So if you wouldn't mind going to the link and filling it out, we'd appreciate that. And the link will also be posted in the chat for this webinar. So we appreciate your time today, and we appreciate any feedback that you want to give us on the webinar, and takeaways and things we could improve on for next time. And then I'll leave you with the final slide. Just thank you for coming and listening. And we hope that you guys got some value out of this. And we look forward to potentially, having more one-on-one conversations with some of you in the future. And again, connect with us on LinkedIn. Feel free to shoot us an email if you have any questions. And we will hopefully be talking to some of you in the near future. Thank you.